Okay, Ian, we're back again, continuing the conversation about military medical research in your role as the psychological lead for the Center for Combat Research. And Annie and I wanted to return to the topic of what research are you working on now that you're most excited about? You said many things, and we derailed you after you talked about one because we had so many things to talk about. Could you tell us something else you're most excited about now?
Yeah, so some of the other stuff we're focusing on that's getting me really excited is for so long, my work was focused on the service member, the military service member themselves, and I think for good measure. And we've expanded now to focus on the entire family unit, recognizing that military health and military readiness is military family member health as well, and that is really important, and that a service member's psychological health doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so some of our work is starting to shift towards promoting mental health, preventing suicide among military families as a whole.
PTSD isn't contagious exactly. Could you explain what's the mechanism by which one person's PTSD becomes a family mental health problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the there's many unfortunate consequences of PTSD, but one of them is disruptions in relationships and relationship functioning. Someone with PTSD might withdraw from their loved ones for various reasons. They might have difficulties managing emotions that then create some difficulties at home. And so treating PTSD helps not just the service member live a more fulfilling life, but it also helps, if they're in a relationship, strengthen that relationship with a spouse, with a child, with a parent, what have you. And then that in turn feeds to a stronger and more resilient service member, which then feeds to a more ready military force.
Nice. That does sound exciting.
Yeah.
So is sort of the status quo, or this sounds important and novel. So how is it done now? Like basically it's not? Or are you literally like pioneering this approach, or has it been done in a way that it's something but not quite what it should be? Or can you describe how you're making a difference and how you go at this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's been nothing. There's been precedents of folks focusing on this, but not that much. Military psychological health research itself, relative to the larger field, is, I don't want to say in its infancy, but it's there's a lot of room for it to be developed. And an even smaller bucket of work has focused on the military family. And so to give you a concrete example, right now we're starting with the basics. Most of my work is either clinical trial focused or more epi focused, bringing in collaborators who know a lot more about qualitative research than I do. We're just starting to talk with military families, talking with the spouse, talking with the kids, and just learning from them through a series of interviews. What are the challenges? And that's going to help us create more kind of end user, if you will, informed research.
You did talk to us about an early experience in graduate school, having some policymaker interested in your studies. Can you talk about your experience in the military space, taking something you created and making actual change?
Yeah, so one thing I routinely will do in the development of a research study, but also as I'm thinking about writing it up and disseminating it, is consult not just with the active duty collaborator or collaborators on the project, but speaking of the willingness of folks to engage, we'll pick up the phone or send an email to other leaders within Department of Defense who I've worked with in the past and pulse check with them. Here's what we found. How would you make sense of this? And or if it's not at the result stage, this is my idea I want to start putting together. I understand you have this challenge. I want to make sure that I can help not just advance the science, but address your challenge. And so those are some of the ways that we'll engage.
And will people tell you? Or is it like giving away a secret?
No.
Are they like, let me tell you, here are the things I need? Is that how should young or old. Any investigators be eager to have those conversations? Is it?
I think so. I mean, of course, there's like a couple projects where they're like, oh, we can't talk about that. You're interested in this niche topic, like that's classified. Okay. But yes, very eager. And because there's, in some ways, my understanding and impression is that there's a lot of really, really smart people, psychologists and other providers and researchers on the DoD side who they might not be able to do things in the way that I, as a civilian, can do research. And my work can hopefully influence and help them, which then helps the military at large.
Can you give me an example of how you could do a study differently than one led by a military-based researcher who isn't academic, civilian academic? A
good chunk of my work in collaboration with other people at CU is focused on firearm suicide prevention. So preventing suicide that's enacted with a personally owned, not military issue, but personally owned firearm. And one of the really recommended public health strategies in this domain is promoting secure storage practices. So it's nothing about whether you own a gun or not, but it's, hey, if you're going through a tough time, for instance, maybe keep that firearm unloaded and locked in a certain location. The most common locking device that's distributed in VA settings and DoD settings is a cable lock that our research has found people don't want those relative to other locking devices for a variety of reasons. And so in order for policy change, or in order to drive policy change to then make different locking devices available, we need to show through research that these are equally, if not more effective, and it's more palatable and acceptable to people. And that's stuff we're working on right now. And that's, we approach it very apolitically, and doing that research outside of a government entity, I think, can be very helpful as well to kind of push things forward.
I will share, I don't know when this was, a few years ago, one of our professors, Dr. Emmy Betts, I know she's a collaborator of yours, and she's the founder of the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative. Here, we do departmental faculty mentoring. You both are witness to that. And one of those early activities, we did an educational program at a shooting range. And she had some fascinating collaborators who were firearm trainers. And there were police and maybe fire, I don't remember, some other, public servant types in local who came, and there were lots of different weapons and they were all unloaded. They showed us how to, look in the chamber and unload and just handle a lot, and just did a lot of education and showed us all these locking devices. And I remember just being so fascinated. I had never been exposed to that. And it was done so respectfully and non-threatening way. I felt totally comfortable looking and touching and playing with it next to some of my colleagues who brought their own personal firearm in their own little carrying case, and they were very experienced. And I think of that often. It was really such a wonderful opportunity to stretch into something kind of unknown and scary and leave feeling like prepared, and that somebody I care about who knows more about this cared enough to help us all come along.
Yeah, absolutely. And to harken back to our conversation on early formable experiences and this idea of cultural competence, Emmy, I think it was 2015, she wrote an editorial in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association. I think, if I recall right, the title was Physician Cultural Competence on, I don't remember the title, but that framed my entire dissertation. I didn't know Emmy yet, and now I'm working with her on these projects. And so that was an early full circle experience. And several of our projects now work directly with firearm businesses, many of which are veteran-owned firearm businesses, so they get it. from multiple angles. And they're collaborators on our research projects, and they make it better.
Would you say the way you've approached these problems with these collaborators, thinking of the end in mind, does that, in your experience, accelerate the impact of what you're doing, speed along? Because I think a big quality and frustration for academics is like, whoa, it takes on average 17 years for some, right? Like, most people want to do this because they're eager to help.
To take that example of the cable locks versus other devices, had I not had that conversation, I've never stepped foot as a patient in a military health system clinic where I knew that was what was being distributed. I wouldn't have been able to identify that as a problem had I not just had that conversation. And so, of course, now the studies that I'm conducting necessarily could, not always, but could have direct impact because I knew what the source of a potential, not problem, but consideration is.
Have you had any government or industry partners that might advance this even further, whether it's, are there gun manufacturers or lock manufacturers who say, I want to partner with you? Or just thinking about some of the other clinician investigators or clinical investigators who work sometimes with a company that's going to have a device to deploy the thing. Is that part of your world at all?
Yeah, that's part of it. And then to kind of link it back to the PTSD.
Or maybe the PTSD,
work,
right?
Yeah, both. But an example from the PTSD realm is right now we're working with some industry partners who are really experienced in marketing campaigns. I have no marketing experience, but part of getting folks into treatment is marketing or into certain services. It might not be formal treatment per se, but like self-guided resources, is making it palatable to them and reaching them where they're at. And there's these great industry partners we're working with who get it and know how to create campaigns and multimedia campaigns that meet people where they're at. And then I come in and say, great, let's study that. My DoD colleagues said that this is a need. I'll study it, you do it, we'll all come together. We'll be one big happy family.
And then
awesome.
Piggybacking off of that, can you talk a little bit about your use of technology in some of your interventions and your research?
Technology has its pros and cons, and I think a lot of its pros are that it can meet people where they're at, and that a lot of people are not willing, able, have the time, resources, what have you, to access formal behavioral health, psychological health services. And so if there's ways to deploy those evidence-based strategies through different mobile health apps, that can really reach an important population. And especially, thinking for folks who are maybe deployed or kind of in environments where there's just not a behavioral health clinician. And so we're working on some of those digital solutions now to promote connectedness, not just addressing a diagnostic category per se, but kind of a holistic approach to someone's psychological functioning.
I guess what I hear to build on that is, the Center for Combat Research has a mission to save and improve lives on the battlefield and at home. And so we're often thinking and hearing about the sort of feedback loop between what we learn in military medical research and civilian type settings. And I hear, thinking about post-COVID world, everybody needs some kind of mental health care. There's not enough people. You can't leave home. We have to use technology to find a way, and that probably what you're describing would absolutely have applications to the non-military world as well, right?
Quite often, absolutely. The interoperability can be really strong. And this is where having collaborators on the military side can help pulse check whether or not in that other direction, the stuff we develop in the civilian world, whether that could be relatable here. And quite often, yes. And quite often, the stuff we develop in the military world will impact the communities in which the service members live or have lived as well.
In your experience working in these multidisciplinary teams and across sectors, so to speak, could you reflect, are there any key skills that you have now or have learned over time that you can think back and say, you know what, for future, my future me, I would have told, prepare yourself, learn this thing to make everything be better?
I would make the case from experience, and I wouldn't have believed this back in the day, but that and this is a whole other topic, we can come back another time, but if you're a good writer, everything else can really fall into place, because writing is about selling an idea, getting people on board, pitching yourself, pitching the idea, communicating your desire to work with someone in an effective way. It just feeds into everything. And so learning early on how to write clearly, effectively, and then as I've learned from my military collaborators, both in this combat center and elsewhere, a little bit of a bluff, a bottom line up front, like don't just meander, like make sure you're very clear. That helps in developing research projects and getting them published and writing the grants. It's our magic.
Okay, that is so fascinating. Okay, so work on your writing. I agree. I agree with you, because whenever we train early career researchers, I always dedicate a third of our training to simply scientific writing. And when we talk about scientific writing for a grant proposal, we are talking about persuasion, right? Because we are asking for money, frankly.
Right.
And that can really carry the day. So one of our courses that's attached to this podcast is specifically on those skills, sentences, paragraphs, pages, because it's a thing. Like, it can actually help you.
And you can get better, and the persuasion aspect is a big one. And then just that writing, improving your writing then translates to improving your oral communication as well. And just like collaborations. I'm reminded of, there's this quote from a writing pedagogy book that I read back in the day. It's, the reader is always right, the writer is always right. Recognizing that people understand things differently than maybe you uttered it, and to find common ground, to find a point of collaboration, you need to be a better writer.
Great wisdom. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thanks for having me. It was nice talking with you both.
Thank you.